My name is Rebecca Lawson. I'm 37 years old, and for most of my adult life, people would probably describe me with words like reliable, calm, or easygoing. Those are polite ways of saying something else. They mean the woman who doesn't complain, the one who keeps things running quietly in the background, the one thing people assume will always still be there tomorrow. For 6 years of my marriage, that's exactly who I was. From the outside, my life looked stable. I lived in a modest townhouse outside Portland, Oregon. I worked remotely as a project coordinator for a small marketing firm. My husband, Daniel, worked in IT support. We didn't have children yet, but we talked about it sometimes, usually in the vague, future tense way couples do, when they believe time is unlimited. Friends who visited our home often commented on how peaceful it felt. The kitchen was always clean. Bills were paid on time. Holidays were organized. Everything looked functional. What they didn't notice was the blue glow from the office down the hallway. That glow became the quiet center of our marriage. Daniel loved video games. At first, it seemed harmless, just a way to relax after work. But over the years, the hours stretched longer. What started as a hobby slowly turned into a nightly ritual that lasted until 2 or 3 in the morning. Headset on, door half closed, voice laughing with strangers somewhere across the world. Meanwhile, I was in the next room, living a life that felt strangely invisible. I cooked dinners that got cold. I watched shows alone. I celebrated birthdays where half the evening happened through a headset microphone. And the strange part is, I didn't explode. I didn't scream or throw ultimatums or stage dramatic confrontations. That's not who I am. Instead, something quieter happened. Over those 6 years, I slowly began to understand the role I had been given in my own marriage. And once I saw it clearly, I also realized something else. Roles can be stepped out of. So one weekend, an ordinary weekend, nothing dramatic on the surface, I made a decision. A calm, methodical decision that took months of quiet preparation. By Monday morning, Daniel's gaming room was still glowing with the same soft blue light, but everything else in his life had changed. Not because I wanted revenge, not because I wanted to hurt him, but because sometimes the only way someone realizes what they had is when the silence they ignored suddenly becomes absence. And that's the story I want to tell today. Not a story about anger, but about the moment a quiet person finally decides not to stay invisible anymore. Before I begin, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever stayed silent in a situation far longer than you should have, simply because you hoped things would change on their own? For most people in Daniel's life, I was easy to summarize. I was Rebecca, Daniel's wife, the dependable one, the kind of woman who remembers birthdays, brings homemade dishes to gatherings, and quietly cleans the kitchen while everyone else is still talking around the table. Daniel's friends liked me. At least, in a polite way, people like someone who never causes friction. When they visited, they'd greet me warmly enough. "Hey, Rebecca, good to see you." Then they'd drift toward the spare room that had slowly become Daniel's gaming space. Door half open, headsets, bright monitors, energy drinks on the desk. I rarely joined them there. Not because I wasn't welcome, but because the room felt like a different world. Loud, fast, full of inside jokes and usernames instead of real names. Meanwhile, my world existed in quieter corners of the house. The kitchen light is on at 7 in the evening. The living room couch where I watch shows alone. The soft ticking of the hallway clock after midnight, when Daniel was still laughing through his headset with people thousands of miles away. At first, I told myself this was normal. Everyone has hobbies. Everyone needs space. And Daniel always said the same reassuring thing whenever the topic came up. It's just how I unwind. So I adjusted. I started eating dinner earlier because he usually logged on around 8. I stopped asking if he wanted to watch movies together on weeknights because the answer was almost always maybe later. Later rarely came. But none of this looked dramatic from the outside. That's the strange thing about invisibility. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens through small adjustments, tiny accommodations that slowly rearrange your life around someone else's priorities. By year 3 of our marriage, a routine had formed. Daniel worked until 5. We ate dinner together, sometimes. Then around 7:30, he'd start checking gaming forums or Discord messages. By 8, the headset was on. By midnight, I was usually asleep. Occasionally, I'd wake up around 2 in the morning and hear him laughing down the hallway, his voice bright and animated in a way I rarely heard during our actual conversations. Those moments were oddly disorienting because the version of Daniel I heard through that door sounded lighter, more engaged, more alive. Meanwhile, our daily interactions had become practical and brief. Did the electricity bill get paid? What should we do about the car insurance renewal? Do we need groceries this week? Functional conversations, responsible conversations, but rarely personal ones. If I'm being honest, I didn't think of myself as neglected back then. I thought of myself as understanding. Understanding wives don't complain about hobbies. Understanding wives support their partner's need to relax. Understanding wives adapt. And Daniel seemed comfortable with that version of me. In fact, I think everyone around us did. Because calm, accommodating people make life easier for everyone else. There were no arguments to mediate, no emotional scenes, no uncomfortable conversations during family dinners. From the outside, our marriage looked peaceful. But there's a quiet truth about being the reliable one in any relationship. When you never demand attention, people eventually stop noticing whether you have it or not. And for a long time, I believed that was simply the role I was meant to play. The steady one, the patient is one, the woman who would always still be sitting in the living room when the blue light from the office finally turned off. At least, that's who everyone believed I was. And for years, I believed it too. If I try to pinpoint the exact moment when things first felt off, it's surprisingly difficult, not because it didn't happen, but because the first cut was so small that anyone else would have dismissed it, including me. It was sometime during our second year of marriage, a rainy Friday evening, the kind of gray Portland weather that makes the house feel warmer when the lights are on inside. I remember cooking pasta that night. Nothing fancy, just something simple. Garlic, olive oil, roasted tomatoes, and parmesan. Daniel liked it, and it was one of those meals that made the house smell comforting. I texted him around 5 that afternoon. Want to have dinner together tonight? A few minutes later, he replied, "Sure, sounds good." That was normal. We both worked from home most days, but Fridays had become one of those quiet traditions where we intentionally sat down together without rushing. So I set the table. 2 plates, 2 glasses of water, a small candle in the middle, mostly because I liked the atmosphere it created when it was raining outside. At 6:30, I called down the hallway. "Dinner's ready." No answer. The faint sound of keyboard clicking drifted from the office. That wasn't unusual. Sometimes he got absorbed in work tasks before logging off. So I waited. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Eventually, I walked to the doorway and leaned gently against the frame. Daniel was sitting in front of 3 monitors. His headset rested around his neck, and a Discord chat window glowed on the left screen. Messages were moving quickly. His team was already gathering. He glanced at me briefly. "Oh, hey." "Dinner's ready," I said. Yeah, just a second." But he didn't stand up. His fingers were still moving across the keyboard. I watched for another moment. The room had that familiar electric brightness, the kind that makes everything outside it feel slightly dimmer. "You said you wanted to eat together," I reminded him, keeping my tone light. "Right, I do," he said. "I just told them I'd jump on for a quick match first." I remember blinking slowly. A quick match? "Yeah, it's only like 20 minutes. 20 minutes didn't sound unreasonable, so I nodded. Okay. I went back to the kitchen. The pasta was still steaming when I sat down. I poured myself some water and opened a podcast episode on my phone while I waited. 20 minutes passed, then 30, then 45. By the time Daniel finally walked into the kitchen, the candle had burned halfway down and the pasta had lost its warmth. He didn't seem to notice. "Sorry," he said casually as he sat down. "Game went longer than expected." I smiled automatically and stood up to reheat the food. "It's okay." And I meant it, at least partly. Delays happen, schedules slip. Nothing about the moment was dramatic. But I remember something very specific while standing in front of the microwave. I realized that when Daniel said a quick match, it hadn't actually meant 20 minutes. It meant until the game ended. And when he said, "I'll be right there," it didn't necessarily mean soon. It meant that after everything else, he wanted to do first. That might sound small. Honestly, at the time I told myself it was small. When I brought the reheated plates back to the table, Daniel was already scrolling through something on his phone, probably the next game lineup. We ate. We talked a little about work, and the evening continued normally, but that night planted a quiet realization in the back of my mind. It wasn't anger. It wasn't resentment. Just a subtle understanding that something had shifted slightly in the balance of our time. Daniel probably forgot the dinner entirely within a day or two. But for me, it became the first tiny moment where I noticed something important. In our marriage, my time adjusted around his, never the other way around. And once you notice a pattern like that, you start seeing it everywhere. After that dinner, nothing dramatic changed. There was no argument, no serious conversation, no emotional moment where I sat Daniel down and told him how I felt. Life simply continued. And that's exactly how small patterns become normal. At first, the adjustments were subtle. If Daniel said he would join me for dinner at 6, I quietly assumed it might actually be closer to 6:30, sometimes 7. I started cooking meals that reheated well, soups, casseroles, things that wouldn't feel ruined if they sat on the stove a little longer. It felt practical, responsible, even thoughtful. Whenever friends asked how marriage was going, I gave the same answer most people do. Good. Busy, but good. And technically, that wasn't a lie. Daniel and I weren't fighting. We weren't in crisis. We were simply living around each other instead of with each other. The gaming routine became more structured over time. What used to be an occasional hobby slowly solidified into a schedule that everyone except me seemed to know. Tuesday nights, ranked matches. Friday nights, team sessions. Weekend tournaments, sometimes 6 or 7 hours at a time. His online teammates had usernames like Iron Volt, Crimson Echo, and Vector Zero. I never met them in person, but I learned their voices the way you learn the sound of distant neighbors through thin apartment walls. I knew who told the most jokes, who got frustrated when they lost. Daniel seemed especially eager to impress. Meanwhile, Daniel and I developed a quiet choreography inside the house. If he were in the office with the door closed, I wouldn't interrupt. If he emerged between matches to grab a drink, I'd say hello briefly, but not start long conversations. At the time, I believed I was being respectful. After all, people deserve space for the things they enjoy, but something else was happening beneath the surface. Little dismissals started slipping into our daily interactions. Not cruel ones, just small ones. One evening, I asked if he wanted to go for a walk after dinner. "Maybe tomorrow," he said without looking up from his phone. Tomorrow came and went. Another time, I suggested we plan a weekend trip to the coast. "Let's see," he replied. "There's a tournament coming up." The trip never got planned. Once, while we were visiting his parents for dinner, his mother smiled at me warmly and said, "Rebecca, you're so patient with Daniel's gaming. Not every wife would tolerate that." Everyone at the table chuckled lightly. Daniel laughed too. "Yeah," he said, "she's pretty low maintenance." I smiled politely when he said it, because in the moment, it sounded like a compliment. Low maintenance, easygoing, understanding. But on the drive home that night, the phrase lingered in my mind longer than I expected. Low maintenance didn't mean valued. It meant not requiring effort. And somewhere along the way, Daniel had started seeing my patience not as kindness, but as default settings. Still, I didn't confront him. Not once. Because by that point, I had already started rationalizing everything. He works hard. Gaming helps him relax. Every marriage has quirks. Those explanations became a kind of emotional cushioning. They softened each small disappointment so it never felt sharp enough to address directly. But there's something important about repeated dismissals, even quiet ones. They don't stay isolated. They accumulate, like tiny scratches on glass. Individually, they're almost invisible, but eventually when the light hits from the right angle, you realize the entire surface has changed. And sometime during our 4th year of marriage, I began to notice something uncomfortable. It wasn't just that Daniel chose gaming over spending time together. It was that he had stopped noticing he was making that choice at all, which meant something even more subtle had happened. My presence in his life had become so consistent, so predictable, that it no longer required attention. I was simply part of the background, like furniture that had always been there, useful, reliable, and completely safe to ignore. Some realizations don't arrive like lightning, they arrive quietly, the way understanding sometimes slips into your mind while you're doing something completely ordinary. For me, that moment happened on a Sunday afternoon. I was folding laundry in the living room. The windows were open, letting in that cool Pacific Northwest air that carries the smell of rain even when the sky is clear. Down the hallway, Daniel's voice drifted from the office. He was laughing with his teammates again. At that point, the sound was so familiar that I rarely paid attention to the words. It was just background noise in our house, like the refrigerator humming or the floorboards creaking. But that afternoon, something he said caught my attention. "Yeah, I'm good," Daniel said through his headset. "My wife doesn't care how much I play." There was a pause. Then more laughter from the speakers. Someone on the other end said something I couldn't hear clearly. Daniel replied, still amused. "Seriously, she's super chill about it. She just does her own thing." I stood there with a half-folded towel in my hands. He hadn't meant anything cruel by it. I could hear that in his tone. To Daniel, it was just a casual comment, something said in passing during a conversation with friends. But the sentence lingered in the room long after the laughter faded. She just does her own thing. I looked around the living room. The neatly organized shelves, the framed photos from our wedding, the plants I watered every week, the couch where I spent most evenings alone while blue light glowed under the office door. It occurred to me that Daniel wasn't entirely wrong. I did do my own thing. I handled the grocery shopping. I scheduled the car maintenance. I kept track of family birthdays and holiday plans. I paid attention to the small details that keep a household running smoothly. And Daniel rarely had to think about any of it, not because he asked me to do everything. But I quietly stepped into that role over time, reliable, self-sufficient, low maintenance. In many ways, I had built the exact version of a partner that required the least effort from him. And once someone grows used to that kind of stability, they stop asking questions about it. They stop noticing the work behind it. They simply assume it will always exist. That afternoon, I finished folding the laundry and stacked the towels neatly in the hallway cabinet. Daniel's voice continued drifting through the office door, full of excitement and energy. For the first time in a long while, I listened carefully to the tone of it. It wasn't the voice of someone trying to ignore me. It was the voice of someone who simply didn't think about me in that moment at all. And oddly enough, that realization didn't make me angry. It made me calm, because I finally understood something that had been quietly shaping our marriage for years. Daniel hadn't intentionally assigned me the role of the invisible, dependable partner. I had accepted it. I had reinforced it. Every time I adjusted my schedule without mentioning it. Every time I stayed quiet instead of expressing disappointment. Every time I chose peace over conversation. None of those choices was wrong on its own. But together, they had created a pattern. And once patterns settle into place, people rarely question them. That Sunday afternoon was the first time I truly saw the shape of that pattern, not as a complaint, not as a tragedy, just as a simple truth. In Daniel's life, I had become the person who would always still be there. And the strange thing about always being there is that eventually people stop noticing the possibility that one day you might not be. The shift didn't happen during a fight. It didn't happen after some dramatic moment where Daniel chose gaming over something important, like an anniversary or a family emergency. If that had happened, the story would probably be simpler. Instead, the moment arrived quietly on a Tuesday evening in early autumn. One of those evenings when the sky turns dark before dinner and the house feels slightly heavier with the change of seasons. I had spent most of the afternoon finishing work deadlines. Around 6, I stepped outside for a short walk through our neighborhood. The air had that crisp smell of fallen leaves, and for a little while, the quiet streets helped clear my head. When I came back home, Daniel was already in the office. The door was open just enough for the familiar blue glow to spill into the hallway. His voice was cheerful through the headset. "Nice shot," he said to someone on the other end. I walked past the doorway without interrupting and went to the kitchen. Dinner that night was simple: roasted chicken and vegetables. Something easy. Something that could sit in the oven and stay warm. At 7, I called down the hallway. "Dinner's ready whenever you want." "Okay," Daniel replied. "Give me a bit." I smiled faintly to myself. "Give me a bit." By that point, I understood what those words usually meant, so I didn't wait at the table. Instead, I sat in the living room with my plate and turned on a quiet documentary. The volume was low enough that I could still hear the occasional bursts of laughter from the office. The house felt calm, predictable, comfortable in the same way routines always are. And that's when something unexpected happened. About halfway through the documentary, there was a short segment about a woman who had spent 20 years working behind the scenes for a large theater production company. The narrator described how she organized schedules, coordinated staff, and solved countless problems without ever appearing on stage herself. Near the end of the segment, the woman said something during an interview. Her voice was steady, thoughtful. I realized one day that everyone assumed the show would always run smoothly, because I'd always been there to keep it that way. She paused before finishing the sentence. But the moment I stepped away, they suddenly saw how much of the structure had been invisible. I remember sitting very still on the couch when I heard that. The documentary moved on to the next topic, but the sentence stayed in my mind, not in a dramatic way, just quietly. I looked around our living room again, the same room where I had folded laundry a few days earlier. The same room where dinner was always ready, bills were always organized, and weekends were usually planned around Daniel's schedule. Down the hallway, his laughter echoed again through the open office door. But this time, I noticed something different. For years, I had been thinking about Daniel's gaming as the center of the problem. How many hours did he play? How often did he choose it over spending time together? But that evening, a different realization settled into place. Daniel wasn't the only one shaping our lives. I was too. And if the structure of our marriage made me feel invisible, then part of the responsibility for changing it belonged to me. Not by arguing, not by forcing him to behave differently, but by making a decision about what role I was willing to continue playing. The thought wasn't angry. In fact, it felt strangely peaceful. For the first time in years, I stopped thinking about how to fix Daniel's habits. Instead, I started thinking about something else entirely: what my life would look like if the quiet systems I had built around him were no longer there. That evening, after dinner dishes were washed and the house grew quiet again, I took out the small leather planner I carried everywhere. Up until then, it had mostly been filled with grocery lists, work deadlines, and reminders. But that night, I turned to a blank page, and for the first time, I wrote down a question that had never appeared there before. What would it take to leave this life calmly? Not tomorrow, not dramatically, just thoughtfully, the way someone plans any other major transition. That was the moment something shifted. Not in our marriage. Daniel didn't notice anything different that night. But inside my mind, a quiet door had opened. And once a door like that opens, it's very difficult to pretend you never saw what was on the other side. Before that Tuesday evening, my silence had been accidental. It came from patience, from avoidance, from the belief that small disappointments weren't worth turning into larger conflicts. But after I wrote that question in my planner, something subtle changed about the way I stayed quiet. The silence became intentional. I didn't confront Daniel about the gaming. I didn't bring up the distance between us or the slow erosion of shared time. From the outside, nothing about my behavior seemed different. If anything, I probably looked even calmer than before. But inside, my attention had shifted. Instead of constantly adjusting around Daniel's habits, I started observing them more carefully. Not in a suspicious way, more like someone quietly studying the structure of a system they've lived inside for years. For example, I began noticing how predictable his schedule really was. Daniel logged into games almost every night between 7:45 and 8:15. If a tournament was coming up, he often started even earlier, sometimes checking strategy forums or chatting with teammates before dinner. His gaming sessions rarely ended before midnight, and on weekends, if his team had scheduled matches, the sessions could stretch well past 2 or 3 in the morning. None of this information was secret. It had always been there. I had simply never paid attention to it as data before. The same thing happened with other parts of our lives. I began reviewing our household finances more carefully. Daniel and I shared a joint account for mortgage payments and utilities, but we also kept separate personal accounts for discretionary spending. For years, I had mostly ignored how those accounts were used. As long as the bills were paid, it seemed unnecessary to examine things closely. Now I started paying attention. Not because I suspected anything dishonest, but understanding your own financial position is one of the first steps toward independence. Quietly, over several weeks, I gathered information: mortgage balance, savings contributions, retirement accounts, credit history. Everything looked stable. In fact, the realization surprised me slightly. If I ever needed to stand on my own financially, I probably could. That discovery didn't bring excitement, just clarity. Meanwhile, Daniel remained exactly the same. One evening, he walked into the kitchen while I was making tea. "You've been pretty quiet lately," he said casually. I smiled. "Just busy with work." He nodded and grabbed a soda from the refrigerator. "Yeah, same here. Our team is practicing a lot this month." The conversation ended there. No tension, no suspicion. And that was the strange thing about the weeks that followed. Daniel interpreted my calmness the same way he always had, as comfort, as stability, as proof that everything in our lives was running smoothly. What he didn't realize was that my silence had stopped being passive. It had become a strategic space, a space where I could think clearly without constant emotional turbulence, a space where decisions could form slowly instead of exploding during arguments. Every evening after Daniel settled into the office, I would sometimes sit at the dining table with my planner. I wasn't writing dramatic notes, just small observations: dates, schedules, ideas, possible timelines, nothing urgent, nothing reckless, just quiet preparation for a possibility that still felt distant. At that stage, I hadn't decided whether I would actually leave. I was simply exploring what the option would look like. And that exploration brought an unexpected feeling with it: peace. Because for the first time in years, I realized something important. My silence was no longer something happening to me. It was something I was choosing. And once silence becomes a choice instead of a habit, it transforms from weakness into something much more powerful. Once my silence became a choice, something interesting happened. I stopped feeling stuck. For years, my mind had been circling the same quiet frustration. Why doesn't Daniel notice? Why doesn't he change? But when I began thinking about my own options instead of his behavior, that question slowly lost its importance. Daniel didn't need to change for me to make a decision about my life. And strangely enough, the moment I accepted that, I started noticing opportunities that had always been there. Small ones at first, things no one else would ever pay attention to. For example, I realized how much time I had quietly gained back for myself. Daniel's gaming sessions weren't occasional anymore. They were consistent, almost like a second job he did every evening, which meant I had hours of uninterrupted quiet in the house nearly every night. Instead of sitting in the living room feeling lonely, I began using that time differently. Sometimes I took online courses related to project management. My company offered tuition reimbursements for professional development, something I had never bothered to explore before. Other nights, I researched housing options in different parts of Portland. Nothing dramatic, just curiosity. I learned about rental prices in neighborhoods closer to downtown. I compared commute distances. I looked at apartment layouts the way someone might browse travel photos, without necessarily planning to go anywhere yet. Meanwhile, Daniel's routine remained wonderfully predictable. Headset on, door partially closed. Laughter echoes down the hallway. Occasionally, he would emerge from the office to refill his drink or grab a snack. We would exchange a few casual sentences, then he would disappear back into the blue glow of the monitors. From his perspective, our life probably looked exactly the same. But behind the scenes, small things were shifting. One evening, while organizing our monthly finances, I opened a separate savings account in my name. Not secretly. Daniel could have seen it at any time if he looked closely at our shared financial dashboard. But he never did. That account became a quiet place where I started directing small portions of my income each month. Not large amounts, just enough to build a sense of independence over time. Around the same period, I also began updating my professional resume. My job was stable, but I realized that if I ever moved out, having stronger career options would make everything easier. So I added new certifications, updated project portfolios, reconnected with a few colleagues in other companies. None of these actions required confrontation. None of them disrupted our daily life. They were simply preparations. What fascinated me most during that period was how invisible all of it remained. Daniel never asked why I spent more time on my laptop in the evenings. He never wondered why I occasionally stayed up later than usual. From his point of view, I was probably just doing what he had always assumed I did, my own thing. And in a way, he was right. But there was another layer to the preparation that went beyond finances and career planning. I started documenting patterns, not obsessively, just occasionally writing down observations in my planner. How often have we actually spent evenings together? How many meals we shared without interruptions? How many weekends passed without a meaningful conversation? The numbers were surprisingly clear. Some weeks, Daniel and I spent less than 2 hours of focused time together outside of logistical conversations. That discovery didn't make me angry. It simply removed any lingering illusions I had been holding on to. Because once something is written down objectively, it stops being an emotional feeling and becomes a fact. And facts are easier to work with. Months passed this way, quietly, methodically. Daniel continued improving his gaming rank. His team occasionally celebrated tournament wins, with late-night voice chats that carried down the hallway. I continued improving something else entirely, my understanding of what life could look like outside the structure we had built together. And through all of it, one truth became increasingly clear. Daniel didn't notice any of these changes. Not the financial preparations, not the professional updates, not the quiet emotional distance that had slowly replaced my earlier patience. To him, I was still exactly who I had always been. The reliable partner, the low-maintenance wife, the person who would always still be there when he logged off for the night. And that assumption allowed me to do something very important: prepare for a future he had never imagined. Preparation has an interesting side effect. The more you learn about your situation, the harder it becomes to pretend you don't understand it. For several months, my quiet planning had been about gathering information: finances, housing options, career flexibility. None of it meant I had decided to leave. It simply meant I wanted to know what was possible. But eventually, there comes a moment when all the pieces of information settle into a single, very clear picture. For me, that moment arrived late one evening while I was reviewing our finances. Daniel was in the office again, laughing through his headset. The familiar rhythm of his voice echoed faintly down the hallway, while I sat at the dining table with my laptop open. I had been calculating something simple. How long could I comfortably support myself if I moved out? The answer surprised me. Between my personal savings, the separate account I had quietly built over the past several months, and my steady income, I could maintain a modest apartment without financial strain. Not luxuriously, but independently. I sat there for a long time after realizing that, because once that question was answered, another one naturally followed. If I could leave, why was I still staying? For years, I had told myself that relationships require patience. Those small disappointments weren't worth turning into larger problems. That every marriage goes through phases where partners drift slightly apart. Those things are all true, but patience and avoidance are not the same thing. And somewhere along the way, I had quietly crossed that line. The real revelation wasn't about Daniel's gaming. It was about something deeper. Daniel believed our marriage was stable because nothing had forced him to question it. My presence had always filled the gaps. If we didn't spend evenings together, that gap was filled by my quiet understanding. If conversations became shallow, that gap was filled by my patience. If emotional distance appeared, that gap was filled by my willingness to accept it. In other words, the structure of our marriage remained stable because I absorbed all the instability myself. And suddenly I understood something that changed everything. If I stopped absorbing it, the structure would reveal its true shape. That realization wasn't dramatic. There was no surge of anger or sadness, just clarity. Because once you see the mechanics of a situation clearly, the decision about what to do next becomes much simpler. That night, I opened my planner again. For months, it had been filled with observations, numbers, and possibilities. But this time, I wrote something different, a timeline. Not a rushed one, not an emotional one, just a calm, realistic plan. 3 months to finalize financial separation, 2 months to secure housing, 1 weekend to move my belongings quietly. The entire plan fit neatly across 2 pages. When I finished writing, I closed the planner and sat quietly for a moment. Down the hallway, Daniel was celebrating a victory with his teammates. I could hear the excitement in his voice. Nice. That was perfect! Their laughter bounced lightly against the walls of the house, and for the first time in years, the sound didn't make me feel lonely. It simply felt distant, because something important had shifted inside me. For years, Daniel's behavior had shaped the emotional rhythm of my life, but in that moment, I realized I had quietly taken control of the timeline, not through confrontation, not through threats, just through preparation. The private reveal wasn't something I shared with anyone. Daniel didn't know. Our friends didn't know. Even my family didn't know yet. The realization existed only in my mind. But that was enough. Because once you understand your leverage in a situation, you don't need to announce it. You simply decide how you're going to use it. And that night, for the first time since the early days of our marriage, I felt something that had been missing for a long time. Not excitement, not relief, just a calm, steady sense of direction. The path ahead was suddenly very clear, and Daniel had absolutely no idea it existed. For a long time, the plan in my planner was just that, a plan. It existed quietly between grocery lists and work deadlines, written in the same neat handwriting as everything else. Sometimes I would glance at it in the evenings while Daniel played games down the hallway. But I didn't feel rushed to act on it, because planning something and deciding to do it are two very different things. There were still questions. Not about logistics, I had already solved most of those, but about something deeper. Was leaving truly the right choice? Relationships are complicated. No marriage fits neatly into a single story about neglect or incompatibility. Daniel wasn't cruel. He wasn't dishonest. He never raised his voice at me or treated me with open hostility. If anything, he probably believed our marriage was peaceful, stable. And in many ways it was. That's what made the decision so difficult. There was no obvious crisis forcing me to leave, just a slow, quiet erosion of connection that had stretched across 6 years. So for several weeks, I allowed myself to consider other possibilities. I imagined what it would look like if I confronted Daniel directly. Maybe we could schedule specific nights without gaming. Maybe we could try counseling. Maybe he simply hadn't realized how distant things had become. Those options were reasonable, healthy even. But every time I imagined having that conversation, the same thought returned, not fear, just honesty. If I told Daniel how lonely I had been feeling, he might change his behavior for a while. He might reduce his gaming hours. He might make a visible effort to spend more evenings with me. But that change would come from pressure, not from awareness. And eventually, once the urgency faded, habits have a way of quietly returning. I didn't want to become the person who monitored how many hours her husband played games. I didn't want to negotiate for attention like it was a limited resource. And most importantly, I didn't want a relationship where my presence only became visible after I threatened to remove it. That realization clarified something important. The real issue wasn't the gaming. It was the absence of curiosity. For 6 years, Daniel had never asked a simple question that might have changed everything. Are you happy? Not once. Maybe he assumed the answer was yes. Maybe my calmness convinced him everything was fine. Or maybe the structure of our life made it easy not to wonder. But once I acknowledged that truth, the decision in front of me became surprisingly simple. I could stay and request attention, or I could leave and reclaim it for myself. Neither option made Daniel a villain, but only one option gave me back control over my own time and emotional space. So one quiet Saturday morning, I opened my planner again. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen window, while Daniel slept late after a tournament that had stretched past 3 in the morning. The house was completely silent. I turned to the page where the timeline was written. For several minutes, I just looked at it. Then I picked up a pen. Next to the first step, secure apartment lease, I wrote a small check mark. The decision point didn't come with dramatic music or emotional speeches. It came with a single quiet action. A phone call later that afternoon. A signed lease agreement was 2 days later. And the calm understanding that once the first step of a plan becomes real, the rest of the path begins unfolding naturally. Daniel didn't notice anything different that weekend. From his perspective, life continued exactly as it always had. But inside my planner, a small check mark now sat beside the first step. And that tiny mark represented something irreversible. The moment when possibility became intention. Once the lease was signed, the plan stopped being theoretical. It became logistical. That change brought a strange kind of calm with it. When you're no longer debating what to do, your mind shifts naturally toward how to do it well. And I've always been someone who approaches transitions methodically. The apartment I rented was about 15 minutes away from our townhouse, in a quiet neighborhood closer to downtown Portland. It wasn't large, just a small one-bedroom with tall windows and a view of a row of maple trees along the street. But when I visited it for the first time, something about the space felt peaceful, not exciting, not dramatic, just quietly comfortable. The move-in date was scheduled for 6 weeks later, which gave me time to organize everything carefully. Most evenings during those weeks followed the same pattern they always had. Daniel logged into his games around 8. The blue glow filled the hallway, and laughter echoed through his headset conversations. Meanwhile, I used those same hours to begin shifting pieces of my life. The process was surprisingly simple. First, I changed the mailing address for my personal bank account and credit cards. Then I updated my employer's HR system with the new apartment address, explaining that I was planning to relocate closer to the city for convenience. No one questioned it. Remote workers change addresses all the time. Next came the practical details, things most people forget about until the last minute. Internet service for the new apartment, a small storage unit where I could gradually move personal items without creating noticeable gaps at home. Utility transfers. Furniture orders are scheduled for delivery the week after the move. Each step went into my planner with the same calm check marks as the first one. Meanwhile, the house Daniel and I shared continued operating exactly as it always had. Dinner at roughly the same time, casual conversations about work, the occasional grocery run together on Saturday mornings. If Daniel noticed anything unusual, he never mentioned it. But in truth, there wasn't much to notice. I didn't pack large boxes or rearrange entire rooms. Instead, I moved things slowly, a few books at a time, some personal documents, clothes I didn't wear often, items small enough that their absence wouldn't stand out immediately. By the fourth week, the storage unit held most of the things that felt truly mine. The rest, larger furniture pieces, kitchen equipment, household items, would remain behind, not out of sacrifice. But I realized something during the process. I wasn't trying to take half of our lives with me. I was simply building a new one. During those weeks, Daniel seemed especially absorbed in gaming. His team had entered a competitive season that required several nights of extended practice. One evening, he stepped into the kitchen while I was reviewing paperwork. "Hey," he said casually, "we might have a big tournament next weekend." "Oh?" I replied. "Yeah, could run most of Saturday." I nodded. "Good luck." He smiled briefly, grabbed a drink, and returned to the office. The exchange lasted maybe 20 seconds, and that was the strange beauty of moving in silence. No arguments, no tension. Just two people living parallel routines in the same house. The difference was that one of those routines was quietly approaching its end. 6 weeks after signing the lease, everything was ready. The storage unit was nearly empty again. because most of the boxes had already been delivered to the apartment. Utilities were active, work systems updated, furniture assembled. All that remained was the final step. One ordinary weekend, a few remaining belongings, and the moment when the house Daniel believed was stable would suddenly feel very different. Not because anything dramatic had happened, but because the quiet structure holding it together would no longer be there. The weekend I chose looked completely ordinary. Daniel's team had a tournament scheduled on Saturday afternoon that usually stretched well into the evening. When he mentioned it earlier that week, I simply nodded. Good luck, I told him. By then, almost everything had already been moved. The apartment was furnished. My clothes and documents were there. The kitchen had the basics I needed. What remained in the townhouse were only a few personal items, things small enough to fit into a couple of bags. Saturday morning arrived quietly. Daniel woke up late, like he often did after long gaming nights. I made coffee in the kitchen while sunlight filtered through the windows. The house felt exactly the same as it always had. Predictable, comfortable, unquestioned. Around noon, he started preparing for the tournament. Headset, energy drink, quick lunch. He gave me a brief smile before heading down the hallway. This one might run long, he said. That's okay, I replied calmly. A few minutes later, the familiar sounds returned. Keyboard clicking, voices through the headset. Laughter echoes softly from the office. I waited until the house settled into that rhythm. Then I quietly packed the last of my things. A suitcase. 2 bags. My planner. There was no rush, no nervous energy, just a slow, deliberate process of checking each room one last time. Not to take anything else. Just to acknowledge the space I had lived in for 6 years. The kitchen where dinners had cooled on the table. The living room couch where I had spent so many evenings alone. The hallway where blue light had spilled under the office door night after night. Daniel's voice rose briefly in celebration down the hallway. Nice, good round. He had no idea what was happening in the next room. When everything was ready, I wrote a short note and left it on the kitchen counter. Nothing dramatic, just a few honest sentences. Then I picked up my bags, stepped outside, and closed the front door quietly behind me. Inside the house, Daniel was still playing, still laughing, still certain that when the tournament ended later that night, everything in his life would be exactly where he left it. But the consequences of 6 quiet years had already begun. He just hadn't realized it yet. Daniel didn't notice right away. The tournament lasted most of the afternoon and well into the evening. By the time it ended, it was already dark outside. When he finally removed his headset, the house must have felt the same as always. Quiet, still, normal. At first, he probably assumed I was in the living room or upstairs reading. That had been my routine for years. But eventually, he walked into the kitchen. And that's where he saw the note. Later, he told me he read it twice before the words really made sense. It wasn't a long message. I had written simply, Daniel, I've been feeling invisible in this marriage for a long time, and I've realized I can't continue living this way. I didn't want a dramatic confrontation or an argument, so I chose to leave quietly. I've moved into an apartment nearby. There's nothing you need to fix tonight. I just needed to step out of a life where I felt unseen. I hope one day we can talk calmly about everything. But for now, I need space to rebuild my own life. Rebecca. That was it. No accusations, no anger, just the truth. Daniel called me about 20 minutes later. I was already sitting on the couch in my new apartment when my phone lit up. For a moment, I simply looked at the screen. His name had appeared there thousands of times before over the years, usually about groceries, errands, or small daily questions. This time felt different. When I answered, his voice sounded confused more than anything else. Rebecca, where are you? At my new apartment, I said gently. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. You moved out? He asked quietly. Yes. Another silence followed. Not angry, just disoriented. I didn't realize things were that bad, he finally said. I believed him. That was the strange part. He truly hadn't realized. But some realizations arrive long after the moment when they could have changed something. And by the time Daniel understood what had been happening in our marriage, the decision had already been made. Not out of anger, just clarity. And clarity, once acted upon, is very difficult to reverse. Daniel asked if we could meet a few days later. Not to argue, just to talk. We agreed to meet at a small coffee shop halfway between the townhouse and my new apartment. It was a quiet place, the kind where conversations naturally stay calm because the atmosphere doesn't allow raised voices. When I arrived, he was already sitting at a table near the window. For a moment, neither of us said anything. He looked tired, not angry, just unsettled in the way someone looks when their life suddenly feels unfamiliar. "Hi," he said. "Hi." We sat down with our coffees between us, steam rising slowly into the air. After a few seconds, he spoke again. "I've been thinking a lot since you left." I nodded, but didn't interrupt. "I didn't realize how much distance there was," he said. "I thought things were normal." "I know," I replied. That seemed to surprise him slightly. "You do?" "Yes," I said calmly. "That's part of why I didn't try to argue about it." He leaned back in his chair, absorbing that. "I wish you had told me," he said after a moment. "I did," I answered gently. "Just not in the way you might have expected." He looked at me confused. "For years," I continued, "I adjusted quietly. I waited for you to notice the distance yourself." Daniel looked down at the table. "I guess I didn't." "No," I said softly. The conversation stayed calm after that. There were no accusations, no raised voices, just two people finally describing the reality they had been living in very different ways. At one point, he asked a question that lingered in the air between us. "Is there any chance we can fix this?" I thought about it honestly before answering. "I don't know," I said, "but I do know something needed to change first." "And leaving was the change?" "Yes. Not to punish him, not to make a point, just to step out of a life where I had slowly disappeared." We finished our coffee quietly. When we stood up to leave, Daniel looked at me for a moment like he was seeing me more clearly than he had in years. But clarity that arrives late can't undo the past. It can only explain it. The first few weeks in my new apartment were quieter than I expected. Not lonely, just quiet in a different way. For the first time in years, the evenings belonged entirely to me. No headset voices down the hallway, no blue light spilling under a door, just the soft sounds of the city outside and the steady rhythm of my own routines. At first, that space felt unfamiliar. When you've spent years arranging your life around someone else's schedule, it takes time to remember what your own rhythm feels like. But gradually, something simple returned. Choice. Some nights I went for long walks through the neighborhood. Other evenings, I read on the couch or worked on professional certifications I had started months earlier. And sometimes, I just sat by the window with a cup of tea and let the quiet exist without filling it. Daniel and I spoke a few times during that period. The conversations were calm, reflective, not about blame, just about understanding how two people could slowly drift apart without realizing it was happening. Whether our marriage will eventually find a new form, I still don't know, but something about my own identity has already changed. For years, I believed being patient and adaptable made me a good partner, and those qualities still matter. But I also understand something now that I didn't understand before. Being calm doesn't mean accepting invisibility. Being supportive doesn't mean disappearing. Today, when I think about who I am, the answer feels simpler than it used to. I'm still patient, still thoughtful, still someone who prefers quiet solutions over dramatic ones. But I'm also someone who knows that my presence in a relationship should never be so predictable, that it becomes invisible. And that understanding has given me something I didn't have before, a life that feels fully my own again. Looking back now, I don't think our story is really about video games. That was only the visible part. The deeper issue was something much quieter. How easy it is for two people to slowly drift into roles that no one ever intentionally chose. Daniel didn't wake up one day deciding to ignore his wife, and I didn't wake up one day deciding to disappear inside my own marriage. It happened gradually, through small adjustments, unspoken expectations, and the quiet assumption that tomorrow would always look the same as today. But life has a way of revealing something important when patterns go on long enough. If someone's presence is always guaranteed, it eventually stops being noticed. And sometimes, the only way to remind the world, or the people closest to you, that you matter, is to step out of the place where you've become invisible. Not with anger, not with revenge, just with clarity. Leaving didn't make me feel powerful in a dramatic way. It simply gave me back something I had slowly lost: my voice, my time, my presence. And maybe that's the real lesson in this story. Respect in a relationship shouldn't begin after someone threatens to leave. It should exist while they are still there. Now, I'm curious about something. If you were in my situation after 6 years of quiet distance, would you have tried to fix the marriage first, or would you have made the same quiet exit I did?
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.